To be here, and I didn't prepare a PowerPoint because I just wanted to focus on the words. And as you listen to the story that I'm going to reveal for you, I hope that it takes you to a place where perhaps you've experienced consumer racial profiling, or you know somebody that has, and that when we do our discussion and our questions, that you can share some of those pieces of your personal experience and connect with the experiences that I'm going to share with you. So consumer spaces are often gendered, raced, and classed, where intersectional forms of oppression exist not in isolation, but as part of a complex, in some cases, contradictory systems of privilege, economic power, social control that uphold whiteness as a structure of dominance within Canada's liberal democratic society. These spoken and unspoken norms offer different and contradictory transactional experiences to diverse groups of consumers, depending on how they are perceived by security guards, retailers, and their staff. This differential treatment arises most explicitly in consumer spaces through consumer racial profiling, a practice of targeting a consumer for discriminatory treatment based on the consumer's race or ethnicity or both, and in most cases intersecting with other identities, including gender and age. Researchers have found that consumer racial profiling affects Black African Canadians, Indigenous peoples, Arab and Muslim communities more significantly than other racial or ethnic groups. More specifically, in retail spaces such as grocery stores, pharmacies, and outlet malls, consumer racial profiling operates on a spectrum. On one side of the aisle, you have a heterogeneous group of consumers. In this context, white women or women perceived to be middle class, white, suitably dressed, may be read by security guards or employees as the right type of consumer and not a security threat. On the other side of the aisle, racialized consumers, in this context primarily heterogeneous groups of Black African diasporic women, are often perceived as security threats and potential shoplifters. Once these consumers are classified as a threat, private arbiters, and I use that term in the context of talking about any of the decision makers, will engage in different forms of consumer racial profiling. From the subtle, for example, a plainclothes loss prevention officer will follow a customer closely, and on the other side, you'll have in terms of a staff person repeatedly asking, "May I help you?" To overt and in some cases extreme actions like physical searches of belongings, body strip searches, police intervention, and also using trespass laws to remove or ban a customer from the premises. It is within these contexts that this paper explores the following research question. In what ways do the legal narratives of Jacqueline Nsia and Mary McCarthy, who were both applicants to 2 human rights cases, will advance our understanding about the impact of consumer racial profiling on Black African diasporic women? For the interest of time, I have removed the methodology and literature review sections of my paper, and please feel free at the end of the discussion to ask me questions, particularly about that. I'll move straight into Nsia's legal narrative. In examining the Nsia decision and news reports, I was able to glean some of the ways consumer racial profiling impacted Ms. Nsia. On February 18, 2003, Ms. Jacqueline Nsia, at the time she was 40 years old, Trinidadian Canadian Black woman with an accent. She is also a single mother with a small child. She'd gone to a Sears outlet store in Mississauga to purchase a bra. Not uncommon, most of us go shopping, so we could probably connect to that experience. After leaving the store, Ms. Nsia was stopped by an older white male security guard, and she was accused of shoplifting. She was then brought, Ms. Nsia had offered at the time when she was stopped by the security guard to show her her purchases and her receipts. However, the security guard did not check any of those items, and instead he brought her back to the store. He took her into a small office where she was detained for over 2 hours. She was denied access to a telephone to call her babysitter of her small son and told to shut up. She was subjected to her first of 2 physical strip searches. and the first search showed up, but there was no bra to be found. Despite having evidence of no evidence of theft committed by Ms. Nsia, the security guard escalated the incident and engaged the services of Peel Regional Police. Although Nevers, who was a security guard, and the Sears outlet store were not named as respondents in the complaint, the tribunal took into account Ms. Nsia's unlawful detention by the security guard and his mistreatment of her in assessing damages. What is significant about Nsia's case, and what you'll hear about Mary McCarthy's case, these are not the norm in a Canadian context or in Ontario. What you'll find in terms of consumer racial profiling, these are anomalies, and very few cases have been successfully litigated. And I chose these two particular cases because they have been successfully litigated, and I think it's important for people to know that. One of the things that was interesting about the Nsia case, the key respondent was the police officer at hand, and the tribunal found, in her findings, she stated that the police officer, during his investigation, had discriminated against Ms. Nsia on the basis of race while in the provision of service because she was Black. Moreover, the police officer called her, and excuse my language, a fucking foreigner. He had asked the security guard if Ms. Nsia spoke English because she spoke with an accent, subjected her to an additional body search, and it's a body strip search, despite video evidence clearing her of wrongdoing. And he threatened to take her to jail if she did not produce a bra because she was Black. The adjudicator used these findings to determine her award for the damages that the degree of emotional upset experienced by Ms. Nsia amounted to mental anguish, and under the Ontario Human Rights Code, that was a violation. Ms. Nsia's legal narrative disrupts consumer spaces by bringing visibility to Black African diasporic women's often invisible narratives of consumer racial profiling. An observation supported by the Ontario Human Rights Commission 2015 Racial Profiling Survey, where Black women responded, stated that they experienced the highest levels of racial profiling in the retail sector. Ms. Nsia shared in her news conference the way she had been affected by the incident. She stated, while in tears, that she'd been falsely accused because she was Black, and as a result, her life had changed. She further stated that going shopping with her little son or being out, it was not the same, and the fear has changed my life. I am not the same. The trauma and the psychological violence experienced by Ms. Nsia is not unlike the trauma and rage and humiliation expressed by African-American legal scholar Patricia J. Williams when she shared this in her book, The Alchemy of Race and Rights. Williams described in 1986 that she had been racially profiled by a young white man, a Benetton's employee, who had denied her entry into the store while white shoppers were in the store. Lastly, as African-American legal scholar Catherine Russell Brown notes, quote, there are personal costs associated with racial profiling. Those who have been subjected to profiling tell stories of fear, alienation, self-doubt, and I argue we must continue to listen to these narratives. Now I move on to discuss very briefly Ms. McCarthy. In the process of degradation and humiliation, Ms. McCarthy, her incident occurred May 22nd of 2011. She was a dark-skinned Black woman in her late 50s from New Brunswick. Ironically, she was a PhD student studying subtle forms of racism in Canadian society when her incident occurred. She went to a pharmacy near her house. It was a Shoppers Drug Mart franchise called Kenny Tan's Pharmacy. The significance of Shoppers Drug Mart is the biggest pharmacy in Canada. It's the biggest retail pharmacy. And while shopping in the dental aisle for mouthwash, Ms. McCarthy was approached by a store employee, and this store employee asked her to unzip her knapsack. She didn't do so. And then what happened next following was Ms. Balachandra, a South Asian woman who'd been working there at Shoppers Drug Mart for 5 years as an evening store person, came over, quote, from Ms. McCarthy's testimony, she said, she came over to me, she asked me, without identifying herself, she asked me to open my backpack. When Ms. McCarthy refused to open her backpack, she was informed that in fact the employee had the right to ask. She left the backpack on the floor. The employee went into the backpack, searched it, without saying anything, basically left her and walked away. In the adjudicator's decision, he explicitly states that I find objectively that racial profiling and discrimination that the applicant experienced, which included being rudely approached because she's Black, being falsely accused because of shoplifting, having her backpack searched because she's Black, and not being apologized to because she's Black, was an extremely serious violation of the code. I have no doubt that she will feel the negative effects of this for the rest of her life. The arbitrariness of consumer racial profile practiced against Ms. McCarthy was highlighted when the adjudicator asked Ms. Balachandra to provide an example where she had asked a customer to unzip their bag in order to look inside. She responded, and I quote, that she was unable to provide such an example, and that the reason that she took this action with respect to Ms. McCarthy was because the store was closed. In fact, this was an issue in dispute when the tribunal, when it was at the hearing. But Ms. McCarthy was able, because she could substantiate her claim that the incident happened at between 10:12 and 10:29, the only way she could do that is because she had a receipt. The significance of this interaction between her and Ms. Balachandra is it demonstrates the intersectional forms of oppression. Not only that, it also demonstrates that in terms of people suspecting that intra-group discrimination doesn't occur, it actually does. And quite interesting that during the hearing, Mr. Tan, who is the pharmacy owner, asserted that there was no possible way that Ms. McCarthy could have experienced racial profiling because Ms. Balachandra was a visible minority. And my assertion is that Mr. Tan's statement was in fact an attempt to erase Ms. McCarthy's experience, and it also speaks to the fact that this is a clear example of how implicit biases, anti-Black racism, and intersectional forms of oppression underpin consumer racial profiling in consumer spaces. However, Ms. McCarthy's counter-narrative Ms. McCarthy's counter-narrative to what Mr. Tan had shared in the hearing really demonstrated the negative impacts and the negative effects of consumer racial profiling and the trauma and humiliation she experienced to the people not only at the tribunal, but when she went on television, she spoke about her experience. In an interview, she states, and I quote, "The pharmacy employee had spoken to me like I was a piece of dirt, left me vulnerable and injured in a horrendous scene where consumers watched as she was being humiliated." African-American scholar Anne-Marie Harris powerfully asserts, quote, "Victims of racial profiling, consumer racial profiling, bear a psychological burden as a result of overt and subconscious discrimination. The repetitive nature of everyday consumer discrimination has a cumulative debilitating effect on the course of somebody's life. Specifically, victims experience an erosion of self-confidence. The exclusion and alienation that targeted individuals experience result not only in individual harm, but societal harm." Both Ms. Nsia and Ms. McCarthy's experiences echo familiar themes expressed by other Black African diasporic women who have shared their narratives about micro-level forms of gendered racism, everyday experiences of intersecting forms of racism and sexism, and discriminatory practices in public and privately owned commercial spaces. Moreover, the multiple layers of othering serve as a warning that Black African diasporic women are treated as security threats in retail spaces, even if implicit bias is at play in some of these places. What remains explicit and embedded in the narrative shared in this paper are reminders that the securitization of retail stores are leaving Black African diasporic women consumers vulnerable to intersectional forms of oppression, stigmatization, and mistreatment. However, what we also take away from Ms. Nsia and Ms. McCarthy's narratives is that while the harms of anti-Black racism, sexism, ageism, perceptions of criminality by decision makers were front and center in both of these experiences shared by these two women, and they also express that through their work and through their pushback, they've set excellent examples of how to use Ontario's human rights system as a tool to bring their legal narratives and lived experiences into the center. Their actions disrupted consumer spaces by challenging the unjust and discriminatory ways consumer racial profiling manifests itself. In conclusion, moving forward, we need more nuanced academic research on consumer racial profiling, informed by a critical and intersectional analysis, as well as legal, social, and public policy responses to and address for consumer racial profiling as a form of gender and race-based violence against diverse groups of African or Black African diasporic women in consumer spaces. Thank you.